My wife, Claire, and I had been looking forward to visiting our old friend Mark, who had recently bought a small farmhouse in rural Indiana. We hadn't seen him in years, and a weekend away from the city seemed like the perfect way to catch up. Fresh air, open fields, no distractions, just us. At least, that's what we thought. We left on a Friday morning. The GPS told us the farmhouse was about 3 hours away, but as we got deeper into the countryside, the paved roads turned into dirt paths, and the signal on our phones flickered between weak and non-existent. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Claire asked, gripping the map we had printed as a backup. I glanced at the GPS, which had frozen an hour ago. "Yeah, I think so. It should be close." The further we drove, the more unsettling the scenery became. The farmhouses we passed looked abandoned, their windows boarded up, their driveways overgrown with weeds. It was as if we had entered a place where time had stopped. Then we saw it, Mark's farmhouse. A small, 2-story farmhouse surrounded by golden fields of corn. It looked exactly like the pictures online, but something about it felt off. Mark greeted us at the door, his face lighting up with excitement. "You guys made it. Come on in." Inside, the house smelled like dust and old wood, as if it hadn't been occupied in years. But it was cozy enough. Claire took out her camera and started snapping photos. "This place is adorable. Look at the view." I followed her to the kitchen window, where the fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon. That's when I saw him. A man stood at the edge of the cornfield, half hidden by the tall stalks. He was wearing overalls, a faded red shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. He wasn't moving, just watching. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Hey, do you see that guy?" Claire looked, but by the time she did, the man was gone. "Who?" "Never mind." That night, the 3 of us sat on the porch, drinking beer and reminiscing about old times. The silence was almost overwhelming. No traffic, no distant sirens, just the sound of crickets and the occasional rustling of corn in the wind. Then we heard footsteps. Claire stiffened. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, setting my glass down. The sound was faint but distinct, slow, deliberate steps on dry leaves. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the cornfield. "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence. Then a low chuckle echoed from somewhere within the stalks. Claire grabbed my arm. "Let's go inside." We locked the doors that night. Around 3 a.m., I woke up needing a glass of water. As I passed by the living room window, something outside caught my eye. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the moonlight, but then it moved. A figure stood just beyond the cornfield, closer this time, and he was staring right at me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. By the time I got Claire to come look, the figure was gone. She didn't go back to sleep that night. Neither did I. By morning, Claire and I were ready to leave, but we didn't want to seem rude. Mark had prepared breakfast, and we didn't want to rush out without saying anything. Except, it wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood and felt my stomach drop. The battery cables had been cut. Someone didn't want us leaving. I turned back to the house, ready to tell Claire, when I saw something sitting on our front porch. A straw hat. The same kind the man in the cornfield had been wearing. My breath hitched. I grabbed Claire's hand and whispered, "We need to go, now." "How? The car?" "We run." We sprinted toward the dirt road, not daring to look back. The cornfields flanked us on both sides, the towering stalks whispering as the wind passed through them. Then we heard it. Heavy footsteps running behind us. Claire let out a strangled cry. "He's following us." I turned my head just enough to see a figure bursting through the stalks, chasing us on foot. He was fast, too fast. We ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached, until we saw a road up ahead. And then, headlights, a truck. I waved my arms frantically as the vehicle skidded to a stop. The driver, an older man with weathered skin, looked at us in alarm. "What the hell happened to you two?" I turned to point back at the cornfield, but the man was gone. The stalks stood perfectly still, as if nothing had ever happened. We made it back to the city by sunrise. We didn't tell many people what happened. Who would believe us? We barely believed it ourselves. A week later, Claire was going through the photos she had taken at the farmhouse. "Oh my God," she whispered. I looked over her shoulder. In one of the photos, taken through the kitchen window, was a blurry reflection. The outline of a man in a straw hat, standing just outside, watching us. I still remember the summer of 2019 with a clarity that sends chills down my spine. It was the summer my brother and I met the man in the field. We were kids back then, me, 11, and my younger brother Thomas, only 9. Our parents had sent us to spend a few weeks at our grandparents' farm in Nebraska. They thought the fresh air and wide open spaces would be good for us. We were city kids, used to concrete sidewalks and streetlights that never went out. The countryside felt vast, endless, and eerily quiet at night. Grandpa's farm was old, sprawling across acres of wheat fields that swayed like golden waves in the wind. A dirt road led from the farmhouse to the main road, but beyond that, it was just fields and an old barn that had seen better days. The first few days were uneventful. Mornings spent helping Grandma with the chickens, afternoons exploring the property, evenings playing board games under the dim light of oil lamps. But then we saw him. It was Thomas who noticed first. We were out by the edge of the field, tossing rocks at an old fence post, when he suddenly stopped mid-throw. "There's a man out there," he whispered, pointing past the wheat. I followed his gaze. At first I didn't see anything, just the golden sea of wheat stretching toward the horizon. But then a figure shifted, just barely visible above the swaying crops. He was standing still, too still. "Maybe it's Grandpa," I suggested, though deep down I knew it wasn't. Grandpa was inside fixing something, and besides, this man was too tall, too thin. We stood frozen, watching. The man didn't move, he just stood there, staring. It was impossible to see his face from this distance, but something about him felt wrong. Then suddenly, he took a step forward. Thomas yelped, grabbing my arm. "Let's go." We ran back to the house as fast as we could, not stopping until we reached the front porch, breathless and wide-eyed. Grandma was inside baking, humming to herself, oblivious to our fear. "There was a man in the field," Thomas blurted. Grandma wiped her hands on her apron and frowned. "A man? Are you sure?" We nodded frantically. She peered out the window toward the fields, her face unreadable. "Well, your grandpa's out back with the tools. Maybe it was just a neighbor passing through." But we knew better. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant rustle of the wheat. The house was old, and every creak of the wooden beams made my heart jump. Around midnight, just as I was finally drifting off, I heard it. A whispering sound. Faint, almost too quiet to notice. It was coming from outside. I sat up, straining my ears. The whispering wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the fields. I crawled out of bed and tiptoed to the window, careful not to wake Thomas. The moon cast long shadows over the land, and the wheat swayed gently in the breeze. Then I saw him, closer this time, standing at the very edge of the field, just beyond the yard. His silhouette was dark against the moonlight. He wasn't moving, just watching. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. I ducked away from the window and shook Thomas awake. "He's back," I hissed. Thomas groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Who?" "The man in the field. He's right outside." He didn't need any more convincing. We both ran to our grandparents' room, pounding on the door. Grandpa answered, groggy and confused. "What's all this racket?" he grumbled. "There's someone outside," I gasped. "In the field." His expression changed instantly. He didn't question us. He just grabbed his shotgun from the closet and marched outside, barefoot, with us trailing behind him. The yard was empty. The field, still. The night, silent. Grandpa shone his flashlight over the crops, the beam cutting through the darkness. "If anyone's out here, you best be on your way," he called. Silence. He stood there for a moment longer before sighing. "Probably just a coyote. Y'all get back inside." But I knew it wasn't a coyote, and I could tell by the way Grandpa's jaw tightened that he wasn't so sure either. The next morning, we found footprints in the dirt just outside the house. Long, deep imprints. Not Grandpa's, not ours. The days passed, but the feeling never left. That sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the wheat, waiting. I never knew who he was, whether he was a thief or some dangerous man lurking in the shadows. I never thought much about the isolation until the night it started. My wife, Anna, and I had moved to a farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania 6 months ago. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place away from the noise of the city, away from the stress of our old lives. The house had been empty for years before we bought it, but it was charming, quiet, and ours. At least that's what we thought. Doors we were sure we had closed were suddenly open. It always seemed to start around 9 p.m. The faint sound of footsteps on the wooden floors at night. Anna would ask if I had left the barn door open, and I would swear I hadn't. The air always felt a little too still after sunset, like the land itself was holding its breath. Then came the knocking. The first time, it was soft, barely audible, like the wind tapping against the walls. It was just past 10 p.m. I dismissed it. But the next night, it was louder. 3 knocks, perfectly spaced. I got up and checked the front porch. No one was there. The fields stretched out under the moonlight, empty and still. I chalked it up to an animal, maybe the old wood settling. The next night, at exactly 10 p.m., it happened again. I waited before opening the door this time, watching from the window instead. The porch was empty, but the rocking chair was moving, not swaying in the breeze, rocking like someone had just stood up from it. I locked the door and didn't go back to sleep. A few nights later, Anna woke me up in a panic. There's someone outside. I grabbed the shotgun we kept by the bed and rushed to the window. At the edge of the cornfield, a figure stood completely still. It was too dark to see details, but I knew whoever it was had been watching us. I stepped onto the porch, gun raised. "Hey!" No response. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. I took a step forward. "I don't know what you're doing out here, but you need to leave." Nothing. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the night, but the figure, it didn't react. Then, with unnatural slowness, it turned and walked back into the field. I should have followed. I should have left, but I did neither. The next day I went to check the barn. Something felt off. The air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of damp hay and something else. Something metallic. That's when I saw the scratches on the inside of the barn door. Deep, jagged gouges, like something had been clawing to get out. I turned to leave. Then I heard it. A voice, whispering my name. "Ethan." It came from inside the barn. The hairs on my arms stood up. I backed away, shotgun clutched in my hands. That night at 9:30 p.m., I locked the barn. But I knew whatever had whispered my name wasn't inside anymore. It was closer. That night, Anna and I barely spoke. The air in the house was thick, like a storm was coming but never arrived. At 9:17 p.m., the knocking returned, louder, faster. Anna clutched my arm, her breath shaky. "Don't open it," I nodded. Then the knocking moved. From the front door, to the back door, to the windows. Something circled the house, knocking as it moved. Then, for the first time, we heard it. A voice, low, crackling, wrong. "Come outside." I gripped Anna's hand. We didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. Then, the rocking chair started creaking again, and this time, it wasn't empty. It was 2022, and my grandparents had asked me to look after their farm while they took a much-needed vacation. I had just finished my first year of college, and figured a few weeks of peace in the countryside would do me some good. The farm was nestled in a quiet, isolated patch of Nebraska. It had been in our family for generations, a large farmhouse surrounded by endless golden fields that swayed like waves in the wind. A rustic barn sat at the back of the property, and beyond it, nothing but miles of wheat stretching into the horizon. Grandma and Grandpa left early in the morning, their old station wagon disappearing down the dirt road. I waved them off, feeling the weight of solitude settle over me as the dust from their tires drifted into the air. At first, everything was as expected. I spent my days tending to the animals, repairing old fences, and enjoying the quiet. At night, the stars were so bright it felt like you could reach up and touch them. The isolation was peaceful, until it wasn't. It started on the 4th evening. I was out near the barn, securing the chicken coop for the night, when I noticed movement in the field. Just a flicker of motion in my peripheral vision. I turned quickly, scanning the rows of wheat. Nothing. The wind made the stalks ripple like a golden ocean, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Still, I felt a strange unease settle in my stomach. I shook it off and headed inside, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But then, the whispering began. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. A faint, distant murmur, carried through the open window by the wind. It wasn't the rustling of the wheat or the usual creaks of the old farmhouse. It was a voice, low, unintelligible. I sat up, heart pounding. Holding my breath, I strained to listen. The sound faded, swallowed by the night. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, or just the wind playing tricks again. But something about it felt wrong. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The next evening, as I finished feeding the horses, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. The hair on my arms prickled. I turned, my gaze sweeping over the land, and then I saw him. A tall figure, standing far out in the wheat field. He was motionless, just a dark silhouette against the fading light. My breath caught in my throat. I shouted, "Hey, this is private property." No response. I took a step forward, but something in my gut told me to stop. He stood there for a long moment. Then slowly he turned and disappeared into the field. The next day, I found footprints near the edge of the field. Deep impressions in the dirt, too large to be my own. That night, the whispering returned, louder this time, closer. Gripping the flashlight beside my bed, I forced myself to look outside. The man was closer now, standing just beyond the yard, watching. I felt frozen, unable to move, my breath shallow. Then, without warning, he stepped forward. That was enough. I grabbed my rifle from beneath the bed, threw open the door, and aimed into the night. "Who are you? What do you want?" I demanded. Silence. And then he smiled. A slow, unnatural grin that sent ice through my veins. Then, as if he had never been there, he turned and vanished once again into the wheat. By morning, I was done pretending this was nothing. I needed answers. I called the local sheriff, but by the time he arrived, the footprints had faded, and there was no trace of anyone. He gave me a half-skeptical, half-sympathetic look. Probably just a drifter passing through. "Happens sometimes," he said, "but if you see him again, call me." I wasn't convinced. Something about the man in the field wasn't normal. That evening, determined to find some clue, I ventured into the wheat. The farther I walked, the more uneasy I felt. The field seemed endless, the walls of grain closing around me. Then I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A clearing, deep in the field. The wheat flattened in a perfect circle. In the center, an old, rusted scarecrow post stood, but there was no scarecrow. Just a pair of boots. Large, worn, and standing upright as if someone had just stepped out of them. That night, I barricaded the doors and kept the rifle by my side. I wasn't going to let fear win, but I also wasn't about to take chances. The whispering came again, louder than ever. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and then the door handle rattled. My breath hitched. I raised the rifle, finger on the trigger. A shadow moved outside the window. I squeezed my eyes shut, whispering a prayer. Then, silence. I don't know how long I sat there, heart pounding, but eventually, the first rays of dawn crept through the curtains. I stepped outside, rifle still in hand. The wheat fields were empty, except for one thing, the pair of boots. Now standing at the edge of the yard,